Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to SFF 180. Thomas here, your host as always. Thank you so much for joining me. So this is probably the most obvious statement in the entire world, but there are far more unpublished novels out there than published ones. But nothing seems to pique the interest of readers more than when an established, even best-selling author has unpublished work. And such books aren't exactly uncommon. Sometimes a writer might just be slacking or faced with too many commitments than they can reasonably manage. In other cases, trilogies and series novels might fail to meet sales expectations, forcing the publisher to drop an author before their story reaches its intended finale. Writing is an art, but publishing is a big business, and like any other business, it is often ruthless. Then there are those books that drift away into the ether because their authors die before finishing them. And when this happens, it doesn't necessarily mean that the books will never see the light of day. In some cases, another author is brought in by the deceased author's estate to complete the work. Even more rarely, the unfinished book might just be released in whatever state it was left in, which happened recently with John Ford's Aspects. And by the way, look out for a somewhat belated review of that coming up on the channel pretty soon. If there is sufficient reader interest and a compelling financial reason to go ahead with publication, then it can happen. But sometimes books just don't exist in enough of a tangible form to allow anything to be released. And when that happens, the books can take on a mystique that haunts fans of the author in question for years, even generations. And so it is 6 of those books that I will be discussing in this episode, starting with some of the lesser known but still notable ones, and then building up to those that would have been significant releases indeed if fate had gone a different direction. Now be aware, some of these little essays might contain mild spoilers for other books. Fans of military science fiction will tell you that Gordon R. Dickson's Child Cycle is one of the foundational works of that subgenre. Now, Dickson, who died in 2001, had planned a sprawling history spanning about 1,000 years, in which the human race has spread out among multiple colonized worlds, resulting in splinter cultures. The 3 most prominent of these are the Dorsi, representing strength and courage, the Exotics, who are philosophers, and the ironically named Friendlies, who are guided by either sectarian faith or fanaticism, and have a bad habit of fighting civil wars. Now, the series more or less detailed interactions and conflicts between the various splinter cultures, with the ultimate goal of reuniting humanity towards the evolution of the responsible man. Now, if Ubermensch stuff turns you off, well then yeah, like me, you probably won't be a big fan of this saga. The initial book, Dorsi, has aged even more badly than most vintage SF, with inane storytelling and a level of misogyny so extreme that it has the unintentionally funny effect of making all the book's male interactions seem like borderline queer-coded. But the series did build a large loyal following, and it got several nominations over the years, with 2 of its novellas winning Hugos. The final book in the saga, Child, was going to be a direct sequel to the 1988 novel The Chantry Guild, describing the final conflict that would resolve everything and finally reunify humanity's warring splinter cultures. But it was never to be. Now here is perhaps the most obscure entry on this list, but Thomas M. Disch is a nearly forgotten writer I feel more people should know about. Disch's heyday would have mostly been the 1970s, 1980s, and he wrote across several disciplines, including poetry, where he was very prolific and well-respected, theater, where he once wrote a play that pissed off the Catholic Archdiocese of New York so hard that they basically declared war on him, and even early computer games. Disch's science fiction is what you might call extremely fucking dark. He dealt in themes of humanity's helplessness in the face of utterly indifferent power. And he hit the ground running with this in his 1965 debut, The Genocides, an alien invasion novel in which we lose, to put it mildly. In the 70s and 80s, he wrote several dystopian books like Camp Concentration, 334, and On Wings of Song, a heartbreaking tale about the suppression of art in a near-future fundamentalist America. These did not sell well, though they are all regarded critically as near masterworks, especially Wings of Song. Also, most of you might be familiar with his children's book, The Brave Little Toaster, if only because Disney animated it. And there is the train. Just a little aside here, in case you would like to hear an example of what it is that makes the Thursday night reading stream so fun. In 2008, 3 years after the death of his partner, Charles Naylor, Disch checked himself out, having suffered almost nonstop depression since. One unfinished novel that we know about would have been The Pressure of Time, which would have expanded upon a 1970 novella set in the aftermath of a plague that appears to have turned at least some survivors immortal, and how this ignites a new kind of class warfare between mortals and immortals. I don't know how important or popular a book this would have been, but the way I see it, it would have been a new Thomas M. Disch novel. It would have meant that he had lived on, and perhaps found choices to make to help him deal with his inner demons, other than the one he ended up making. Now, this next book is an exception to the others on this list, in that the author is still alive as of this recording. Samuel R. Delany is one of science fiction's most groundbreaking and controversial voices, defying norms while introducing themes and topics once considered deeply taboo into the mainstream of science fiction thought. In 1984, Delany published Stars in My Pocket Like Grains of Sand, a sprawling epic set in a distant future where humanity is spread out across thousands of worlds. Now, Delany is famous, or infamous, depending on your point of view, for his explorations of sex and gender, and a central cultural conflict in the novel is between two ideological factions. One of these promotes a heteronormative nuclear family structure, while the other favors greater sense of social diversity. But these themes are all part of a greater whole in which these human societies, some of which are interacting with aliens, are trying to develop long-term survival strategies. Stars in My Pocket was intended to be the first half of a duology, but the second book, The Splendor and Misery of Bodies of Cities, remains unfinished to this day, leaving a whole lot about the story unresolved. Now, Delany has been very upfront about the unlikelihood he will ever go back to it. His reasons for abandoning the project include the breakup of a relationship that had inspired much of the first book, and the rise of the AIDS epidemic in the 80s, which refocused Delany's interests as a writer. Now, despite its incomplete state, Stars in My Pocket was extremely well received, and has continued to be influential. The Hugo-nominated hip-hop group Clipping recorded an entire concept album inspired by it. And now we get to an unwritten sequel that has sparked more discussion and speculation and argument than any other. Chapter House Dune, the sixth and last of Frank Herbert's original Dune series, was not meant to be the last. That book ends on a cliffhanger, and when it was originally released, Frank Herbert was already announcing his intention to write a seventh and final novel, to wrap up all the loose ends and bring the saga to a close. His death in 1986, unfortunately, put those plans to a halt. Jump cut to several years later, and Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson are well into their project of keeping the Dune IP chugging along with new sequels and prequels. Now, according to interviews, Brian Herbert was alerted by an estate lawyer to the existence of a couple of safe deposit boxes his father had owned, and the existence of which he had previously been unaware. Opening them up, he discovered a couple of old-school floppies containing around 30 pages of detailed notes for Dune 7. These notes eventually formed the foundation for the books Hunters of Dune and Sandworms of Dune, written by Herbert and Anderson as a finale to the original series timeline. And of course, this is where fandom has had a great deal to say. The ongoing Dune novels that Brian and Kevin have been writing are a fairly unique enterprise in science fiction, because these guys have now written more than 3 times as many Dune novels as Patriarch Frank ever did, which would not be happening if they weren't selling. And yet, I don't think I've ever spoken to a Dune fan who actually enjoys them. I admit I've only read one. I didn't find it dreadful, though I admit its mere existence felt not entirely necessary and more than a little fan-servicey. It's like, think of all the needless changes and additions Peter Jackson made to the Hobbit storyline, just to pad the whole thing out into a 9-hour movie trilogy. Or the way the Rings of Power contrives its whole oddly uneven narrative out of Tolkien's appendices and notes, and you'll get an idea of how one of Brian and Kevin's Dune novels read. It's like, we did it because we could, not necessarily because we should. So when it comes to books like Hunters and Sandworms, yeah, they have a right to be judged on their own merits, but because Brian and Kevin aren't making Frank's 30 pages of notes public, we have no way of knowing how close or how far from the book Frank Herbert had in mind these novels are. We're reading sequels, but are they canonical sequels, faithful to the original vision, or just estate-approved fan fiction? That Octavia E. Butler was one of the 20th century's most important SF writers is not up for debate, and the way in which the authoritarian dystopia of her two Earthseed novels, Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, mirrors the current political climate in the United States more than 25 years after they were written, is downright spooky. I gotta say, if science fiction has to be so damn prophetic, why does it always have to be the darkest visions of our future and not, Star Trek? I guess the path of human civilization never really changes. To give you a very quick rundown, these two novels, which open in the year 2024, tell the story of Lauren Olamina, a young woman with a condition called hyperempathy as the result of her mother's drug abuse. Basically, Lauren is so attuned to the feelings of others that she feels their physical pain. Society around her is in a state of almost total deterioration, which leads to the rise of an authoritarian president named Donner, who campaigns on the slogan, "Make America Great Again." Driven from her home in a gated community by riots, Lauren travels north with several companions who eventually become followers of a religious movement she creates, Earthseed, which preaches God is change and foresees humanity's destiny among the stars. Now, perhaps due to both Butler's increasing stature in the years after her death, as well as the story's eerie parallels to the present political moment, Parable of the Sower finally became a New York Times bestseller in 2020, 27 years after its initial release. Now, Butler envisioned no fewer than 4 more Earthseed novels, but shortly after starting work on Parable of the Trickster, which was to be number 3, of course, she became almost completely blocked, unable to make any headway or wrestle all of her plot ideas into cohesion. Now, around 10 years ago, a critic named Jerry Canavan with the LA Review of Books announced that he'd been allowed to read Butler's notes for the book and describes a collection of plots that, as he put it, began to multiply beyond all reason. Trickster begins with the followers of Earthseed, who have finally left the Earth to fulfill Lauren's dream. And yet, they awaken on a barren, desolate, and completely miserable world they call Bo. Now, from here, Butler drew up notes for every possible direction the story could have taken. The viewpoint character for most of them isn't Laura, but one of her followers, Imara. In some notes, Imara is the truest of true believers. In others, she has become a skeptic and heretic. Butler considered a twist, making Lauren the ultimate hypocrite cult leader, no less evil than the powerful rulers she was claiming to liberate her followers from. Some plot lines included a murder mystery, and so on, and so on, and so on. But in the end, Butler simply couldn't figure out a direction that worked for her. It's fair to say that in spite of her often pessimistic stories, Butler did truly believe that the human race could figure out a way to unshackle itself from the crimes of its history and reach its full potential. If anything is to be learned from her inability to pull this novel together, perhaps it's that dreaming about humanity reaching its fullest is one thing, figuring out how we get there is another. And last but not least, we come to the author who probably has the most famous and widely talked about non-existent book in all of science fiction. Now buckle up, because this is a story. Philip K. Dick is probably the unlikeliest mainstream superstar 20th century science fiction could have produced. Now, his books were wildly philosophical, metaphysical, questioning the nature of reality itself, almost all of them with protagonists who were not the square-jawed heroes of classic space opera, but hapless normies, struggling to maintain their sense of identity in the face of forces beyond their control, whether governmental, or corporate, or alien, or even divine in nature. And yet more Hollywood movies have been drawn from his work than nearly any other author apart from guys like, I don't know, Michael Crichton or Stephen King. And I don't even want to guess at how many master's theses or doctoral dissertations have been produced, analyzing his work down to the tiniest detail. When PKD died following a series of strokes in 1982, he left behind a vast collection of personal papers and one unfinished novel. And to discuss this book, we're going to have to get into the man's life a little bit, because if any author had a life that mirrored the cosmic strangeness of his stories, well, this gets pretty strange. Late in February of 1974, PKD experienced what he took to be a life-changing theophanic event, though I suspect that there was a strong chemical element involved. After all, PKD had had a long history of amphetamine abuse and had made at least one suicide attempt by this point in his life, and on this particular day, he was recovering from the effects of sodium pentothal, following surgery for an impacted wisdom tooth. So he answers a knock on the door, which turns out to be a young delivery woman from his local drugstore, who is dropping off some Darvon, which, by the way, is a stupendously dangerous opioid that was taken off the market in the US in 2010. So PKD notices that this woman is wearing a necklace with the Christian fish symbol. And as he asks her about it, according to his account, the sun gleaming off the pendant produces a pink beam, which apparently penetrates his brain and enables him to see God or whatever. As he later put it in an interview, I experienced an invasion of my mind by a transcendentally rational mind, as if I had been insane all my life, and suddenly I had become sane. Eventually, PKD resolved this transcendentally rational mind into an entity he called VALIS, or the Vast Active Living Intelligence System, and he continued to experience hallucinations and visions throughout March of 1974. Of course, PKD journaled all of these experiences, which ultimately added up to over 8,000 pages of writings, a small portion of which were eventually published in the book The Exegesis of Philip K. Dick. So, while you are taking the time you need to drink all of that in, you're probably asking, how does this lead us to the unfinished novel? Well, PKD's visions of 1974 basically altered the focus of his fiction for the remaining years of his life, from his highly popular semi-autobiographical novel, A Scanner Darkly in 1977, all the way to his final work, the Valis trilogy. PKD became intensely focused on questions of how real reality is, and if that sounds very familiar to you, it should. The influence of PKD's themes on popular culture cannot be understated, inspiring later generations of artists to explore many of the same ideas through the lens of their own life experiences. An Owl in Daylight was intended to be the most complex novel PKD had ever attempted. He himself described it as his Finnegan's Wake, and you'll all have to decide for yourself whether that's a good or a bad thing. The title, An Owl in Daylight, is a metaphor for not being able, through our own limitations and circumstances, to perceive properly. Owls see extremely well in the dark, but in broad daylight, not so much. Now, there's been more than one plot description making the rounds since PKD died, and based on some correspondence that was eventually published, the finished book might have been some kind of mosaic novel or story within a story kind of thing. This first plot involves a race of aliens with no ability to hear sound. They communicate with each other by telepathically projecting patterns of color and light. But among these aliens are mystics who have been having dreams of our world, good old Earth, in which they're able to hear sound. So the details here are a little hazy, but somehow these aliens have a spaceship that manages to get them here. They kidnap a musician named Ed Firmly and stick an implant in his brain containing the uploaded, digitized mind of one of their mystics who can, in turn, transmit back to their ship. The problem is, as a musician, Ed is super basic, producing lame and forgettable commercial pop jingles that quickly bore his alien observers to tears. So the aliens decide to violate the Prime Directive, as it were, and give Ed an inspirational boost by transmitting some of their color communication, as well as some mathematical formulas. As a result, Ed's talent gets power leveled, and though his commercial career dwindles, he becomes a respected musical innovator. But this comes at a cost. The increased activity of the implant is damaging Ed's brain. The aliens decide to reveal themselves, which I imagine being an awkward moment for everybody, and offer to remove the implant and save Ed's life. But, having touched greatness, as it were, Ed chooses to keep it, knowing it will shorten his life expectancy, but grateful for the opportunity to have reached his full artistic potential, rather than just grinding away for the rest of his life as a mediocrity. Now, that all sounds pretty straightforward, but in his correspondence, which is collected in a book called The Selected Letters of Philip K. Dick, Volume 6, PKD was throwing out a bewildering array of ideas and struggling to pull them all together, right? Kind of like Octavia Butler. He talks about the concept of the bicameral mind. He talks about Dante and Beethoven. He's got all these ideas percolating throughout his head. Another rumored plot involved a scientist creating a kind of virtual theme park controlled by an AI, which, like all AIs in science fiction stories, quickly becomes self-aware and decides that it is offended that its mighty galaxy brain has been put to use maintaining a theme park, and so it traps its scientist creator within his creation. The scientist must then find his way out through 3 different realms, as it were, making the whole book a kind of science fiction pastiche on Dante's Divine Comedy, Inferno, Purgatory, Paradise. Some PKD fans have speculated that the story of Ed Firmly and the aliens would have been one of those realms, although which one is not exactly clear. As you might have guessed, such a sprawling and ambitious project was becoming daunting. In a letter to Ursula Le Guin in September of 1981, PKD says, "In all fairness, I must admit, Ursula, that I'm beginning to lose vitality in this effort. I've worked out the basis for my new novel, The Owl in Daylight, down to the smallest of the characters, but now I find myself too weary to start the actual typing." By the way, here's a little trivia. PKD and Ursula Le Guin attended the same high school at the same time, even though they never met in person. And if you've never seen young Ursula Le Guin, well, here you are. Sadly, PKD's untimely death, barely 6 months after he wrote that letter, means An Owl in Daylight will forever be the novel we will never read. But for a book that doesn't exist, it's a tribute to PKD's whole mystique that it's probably been talked about as much as his most popular works. It has had an interesting afterlife, so to speak. In 2009, PKD's widow Tessa self-published her own novel under that title, which she claimed was an attempt to express the spirit of PKD's proposed novel. But the estate was not appreciative of the gesture, and so she willingly withdrew the book from publication. And also, in the late 2000s, a biopic about Philip K. Dick, titled An Owl in Daylight, was apparently in pre-production, with Paul Giamatti attached to play PKD. And apparently the script was going to attempt to weave the story of PKD's real life with what I'd be willing to bet was a major focus on his 1974 visions, together with what Giamatti referred to only as one of his last stories. Now, obviously, that never went before the cameras, but it is a movie I'd love to have seen. And there you have it, 6 science fiction novels, alas, we will never read. But we can dream, and we can speculate, and we can ponder. That is what being a science fiction fan is all about, is it not? So, thank you again for joining me. If you enjoyed watching, please hit that like button, share the video far and wide with all of your SFF reading friends, and above all, please subscribe. If you have not done so, that is how the channel grows. There are multiple ways to support the channel through my Buy Me a Coffee page. Down below, I believe there will be a little button saying whatever it is, a little super like or what have you. One-time donations, all monies donated to the channel go to pay Matt Olson, my wonderfully talented and gifted channel artist, who does all my amazing and incredible thumbnails for me. Never any AI art on this channel, it's all Matt. But I would like to thank all of you again for being the very best viewers in all of BookTube. And until I see you all next time, stay safe, stay healthy, and happy reading.